Welcome everyone. I'm filling in for Phil Gibbons. Phil Gibbons has COVID. Maybe Phil's online. I hope you're well out there in online land. So Heather Burns, look forward to your final seminar and all the work to do with post-fire recovery strategies. So thanks a lot.
David. All right. Hi, everyone. As David mentioned, I am talking about my PhD research today. I'm going to be talking about supplementary habitat after fire, more specifically coarse woody debris piles, and how they help small mammal and reptile populations recover in burnt areas. I have the absolute pleasure of being supervised by Phil Gibbons, Jeff Carey, David Lindemeyer, and Renee Brawata, and all my funding was provided by the ACT Environmental Planning and Sustainable Development Directorate. So I want to thank them for that. I also want to acknowledge the traditional owners, the Ngunnawal people on the land, which I have done most of my study and all of my fieldwork, and just acknowledge their ongoing connection to country. So as we start off here, just a little bit of background about fire in the environment. So fire has long been a key part of the Australian landscape in many different ecological communities. It provides key functions like nutrient cycling, and it also does alter the habitat in quite a few ways. So it can temporarily remove ground cover, and how quickly that ground cover recovers depends on a lot of different conditions. And it can also alter habitat quality and quantity. So it can remove high severity fires, can remove large hollow logs at ground level, as well as leaf litter, which can be really valuable resources for small mammals and reptiles in particular. Alongside that, predation pressure is increased in these really simplified post-fire landscapes. And that has been, in the past 200 years, has been increased in Australia with the introduction of foxes and cats. So there have been studies that show that feral cats in particular actually will go out of their way to go towards burnt areas and search out those areas because they know that it's easy to hunt there, there's limited ground cover, and the prey is vulnerable. So that increased predation pressure, loss of structural elements and habitat makes native small mammals and reptiles particularly vulnerable. So my PhD centers around trying to find some practical solutions that we can use potentially after the next fire, whenever that eventually happens. So as just a bit of an outline of the structure of my PhD. So we had, I did a literature review and then two similar studies based on the same round of fieldwork that looked at the effects of our supplementary habitat for reptiles after fire and also for small mammals. And then at the end, I also looked at the thermal properties of my supplementary habitat in these post-fire landscapes. So each one of these is going to be individually prepared and submitted as a manuscript to a journal. And they're all at various stages of going through that process. But these will be the 4 core chapters when I submit my thesis. So starting off with our lit review, we basically started off looking for, so a bit of inspiration from literature on what have other people done after fire to kind of help small mammal and reptile populations recover. And the answer is we did not find much. So we decided to do a literature review, and we wanted to look a little bit beyond post-fire landscapes since there's not much there. So we ended up looking at what has been done to help small mammals and reptiles and other terrestrial vertebrates mitigate the threats of predation, landscape simplification, and loss of refugia in other disturbed environments. So that can include production forestry, agricultural land, mining, things like that. So we wanted to see what of the few things that have been done after post-fire, what were those different options? And then what has been used in other contexts that we could potentially use as a suitable test in a post-fire environment. So we ended up doing a systematic map and a systematic review that involved setting out a set of inclusion criteria beforehand so that we had a repeatable methodology that was as unbiased as possible when we were going through all of our literature. And that set out rules such as what type of species we're looking at. So we're looking at all terrestrial vertebrates, the type of disturbances and interventions that we would be examining. And then we use these inclusion criteria to screen all of our studies at various levels. So the first level that we screened out was the title level, because it's really easy to eliminate off-topic papers at the title level without having to read the whole paper. So we did that first. And as you can see with this flow chart here, we started out with around 14,000 studies, and we were able to eliminate the vast majority of them, around 13,000, just at the title stage. So because I had such a broad search string, it captured quite a few studies that were not related to what I was interested in. So I was able to eliminate those before at quite a low effort stage, rather than having to read the full text and decide that, yep, like I thought, that wasn't relevant. Then we moved on to screening at the abstract stage and then at the full text stage. So there were fewer and fewer studies as these different stages went on. At the end, we ended up with 72 studies at the full text stage. So once I got to that part, I collected some metadata from these studies, and that was related to the type of information that I wanted to get from these studies to answer some of my research questions. And these, like the inclusion criteria, a lot of my metadata categories were standardized before I started the analysis, so that I knew I identified beforehand what I was interested in collecting, how I was going to categorize those, and then I collected that data, just so that this is as repeatable as possible. I got us some high quality data. And then I analyzed all of my metadata with a few different categories. We were looking at the geographic distribution. So where were these studies taking place around the world? What vegetation types were these studies being done in? What vertebrate groups were these studies looking at? What kind of disturbances were they being studied in? What interventions were being used? And then also some management considerations. So particularly when it came to management considerations, I was able to consult some staff within the ACT government to see what they find important when they're looking at considering what interventions to use, what were some important factors. So they mentioned that the costs, both the initial setup cost and the ongoing cost of these interventions is important, and also kind of targeting, are there any impacts on non-target species that we need to be aware of, things like that. So I did include that as an analysis category as well. And the output of this was a really amazing database that has information from all of these different metadata categories in one place. So this will be published as supplementary material along with my literature review manuscript that is in the process of being submitted to a journal. And hopefully this database will be able to provide land managers in the future with a resource to, alongside reading the manuscript that I will be sending in, provide a resource that they can then look and kind of filter through with the different categories and find exactly what they're interested in and how I use that in my results. So hopefully that's a good ongoing resource that can be used in a lot of different contexts, not just after fire. So what did we find? Some of our initial findings, there's quite a few graphs, so I simplified some of them into dot points so we don't have a million slides of graphs. But one of the first things that we saw was that small mammals and reptiles were the most studied vertebrate group. So I was looking at everything from amphibians, small mammals, reptiles, and then medium and large size mammals, but by far small mammals and reptiles were the most commonly studied. We did find that only 2 studies examined fire. So that's a really big knowledge gap that we already kind of knew going into this, but I feel like it really highlights the need for more studies in the post-fire space. Alongside that, the 2 studies were only conducted in after prescribed burns. So prescribed burns can have different intensities and different impacts on the landscape that are often a little bit less intense than a higher severity burn would. And studying the impacts of or testing interventions after these high severity fires is really important, because it could be that these interventions are more effective, less effective under different burn severities. So that was also another knowledge gap that we identified. There was also very few studies that reported the initial and ongoing costs. So out of the 72 studies, only 4 of them mentioned how much the setup costs were for their interventions, and only 3 of those 4 studies mentioned any ongoing costs. So that's also a really big gap as managers try to take this information from these studies and implement it. Having that cost benefit analysis would be really important. And then also there was very limited reporting on effects of any of these interventions on non-target species. Getting into more of the details. So these are the interventions that were used in our studies. You can see that coarse woody debris manipulation, predator control, and revegetation were some of the most common. Coarse woody debris manipulation was typically in production forestry landscapes. So it's really common for after sites are clear felled in production forestry areas that they take the slash, which is the offcuts, and form them into piles. And that has been shown to be beneficial for small mammals in those areas. That's typically been done in North America. I'm not aware of as many studies here in Australia. There's also, we do have predator control and predator exclusion, and just a brief bit of detail on that. Predator exclusion typically involves fences kind of similar to Mulligan's Flat. So you have a big, really expensive fencing system that keeps out predators, but there's a lot of upfront costs, and then there's a lot of ongoing costs to maintain that fence line. Whereas predator control typically is, this is lethal predator control. This is baiting, shooting, trapping, things like that. So that's a bit easier to do at a landscape scale, but it also does have pros and cons. And then on the flip side, herbivore control and exclusion. So herbivore control is more reducing stalking numbers and things like that, versus herbivore exclusion. You can kind of keep typically livestock like cows, sheep, things like that out of certain areas using already existing livestock fencing. So that's why you can see here herbivore exclusion is a lot more popular than predator exclusion, because those upfront costs are typically lower. You can use fencing that already exists in the landscape. In terms of the threats that were being mitigated, so we were, like I said earlier, there's like the three main threats after fire. We have the limited availability of refuge, predation, and vegetation removal and simplification. So in terms of limited refuge availability, coarse woody debris manipulation, like I said, was the most common. There were very few studies that looked at artificial refuge for terrestrial vertebrates. And this is really interesting because the most common artificial refuge that we're all familiar with is nest boxes. And that's been done, nest boxes, bat boxes for arboreal mammals like gliders and possums, birds, and then also bats has been done really frequently. And there's a large body of literature around that. However, artificial refuges, like nest boxes at the ground level, artificial burrows, artificial habitat in that kind of sense has not been done nearly as much. So that might be a bit of an understudied area worth looking into. In terms of predation, like I said, the control is a bit less expensive, easier to do at a wide scale than exclusion. So that explains those differences there. And then in terms of the vegetation removal, revegetation was really common in post-mining landscapes and some after production forestry as well, where you kind of have no seed bank left, and you do have to kind of go in and manually replant those to get vegetation back. In terms of a post-fire environment, that would typically be not necessary unless you are working in an environment that has a hard time recovering from fire. So in my study sites, as we'll get to in a minute, those landscapes are have evolved with fire as a frequent part of the landscape. And so revegetating those areas would not be always a necessary part of an intervention after fire in those areas. But anyway, it was interesting to see what the spread of different interventions were and kind of give us a basis on what we wanted to do. We also broke it down by what interventions were used to help which different vertebrate groups after fire. So you can see that there were quite a few different, there was a large variety of things that were tested for small mammals and reptiles, not as many for medium and large size mammals or amphibians. Moving on to my field experiment based. So once we had done this literature review, we started thinking about, what would be a suitable option for us, given everything that we've learned and the restrictions of the areas that we're working in. We were still working against the threats of predation, landscape simplification, and loss of refugia. And we wanted to know how supplemental habitat could benefit small mammals and reptiles after fire. And we decided to use coarse woody debris piles because we'd seen that they did have quite a strong, they were quite successful in post-production forestry landscapes. And then closer to home here in Australia, there was also a study that was done in the early 2000s where Tony Arthur and a few other people had tested offcuts from a pine plantation. So that was just like limbs and small branches that were covered in chicken wire, and compared house mice populations that were living in these coarse woody debris piles, and compared them to a fenced predator exclusion area, and found that there was no significant population difference between these coarse woody debris piles covered in chicken wire and an actual predator exclusion area. So that was a pretty exciting find, and we wanted to see whether we could replicate that in a burnt landscape and with native species. So this was the study area we were working with in early 2020 during the Black Summer fires. A large proportion of the ACT and also around 80% of Namadgi National Park here was burnt in the Aurora Valley fire. So you can see here on the left, this is the fire scar. This is the map of fire severity. The darker areas are higher severity and the lighter areas are a bit lower severity. And we wanted to work within both the high and low severity areas. So we stratified our sites and we added 10 blocks into high severity burn areas and 10 blocks into low severity areas. And we used a randomized block design that was located all in dry sclerophyll forests, because dry sclerophyll forests are pretty widely distributed throughout the park, and they have easy accessibility with fire trails and things like that. This is what it looked like in practice. So you can see up at the top, we at each experimental block, so there's 20 experimental blocks throughout the park, we set them up with 4 treatments, and those treatments were randomized. So they weren't in a set order every time. They were located 50 meters from the road and then 100 meters in between each treatment to minimize the chances that animals would move in between the different treatments, and we would count them twice. So these are some pictures of what our coarse woody debris piles look like. So the one on the left, we did try a couple different variations on our design. So the first one we had was a structure only treatment. And that was just these coarse woody debris piles here, piled together in 4, kind of laid out in a square. And the piles were around 3 meters in length and about 1 meter wide. And the benefits of these were that traditionally, coarse woody debris addition in a landscape involves using really big, large diameter logs, which can be really hard to get into remote areas. It can be kind of hard to source in some instances as well. So we ended up using branches and small bits of wood that were already existing in the burnt landscapes and kind of piled them together to take resources that wouldn't be great habitat on their own and combine them into something complex that could potentially provide more beneficial habitat in combination. And then, so that was our structure only. We then took those coarse woody debris piles and covered them in chicken wire for our structure and predation treatment. And then there was also a third treatment where we had just strips of chicken wire because we wanted to test the effects of that on its own as well. And those were arranged in the same orientation that you can see here. So 4 strips in a square. And then we also had a control where there were no treatments that were added. So we went out and visited our sites quite often, and we used a couple different methods to survey small mammals and reptiles. So when we were looking at small mammals, we used a wildlife camera, as you can see on the top left there. And it was oriented facing down on a star picket around 70 centimeters off the ground, facing down at a quartile that was baited with tuna oil and sesame oil, because that's been proven to be effective in the past. And then we had those cameras out in the field from January of 2022 until March of 2023, and they were continuously collecting data. We would go and change the SD cards and the batteries once every 1 to 2 months, depending on how easy it was to access some of our remote sites. When we're talking about our reptile surveys, we did both visual and active surveys, and we did these once per summer season. So our season was between November and February of each year, when the temperature was between 16 and 30 degrees and reptiles are most active, and we aimed for sunny days, but La Nina kind of had other plans, so we did the best that we could. And we would go out, and the visual surveys involved going out and surveying and recording any reptiles that we saw that were out basking on logs. And then the active surveys involved kind of picking up rocks and logs, seeing what was living under those. And we also, in those surveys, ended up taking apart our coarse woody debris piles and seeing what was living under there, and before we put them back together. And having this combination of surveys allowed us to get a wide range of different functional groups of reptiles. The more different types of surveys you have, the more likely it is for you to get a broad picture of all the reptiles in your area. We also measured some habitat components. So we looked at the availability of natural large coarse woody debris and rocky outcrops so that we could quantify the amount of available natural habitat nearby our structures. We wanted to see whether that had any impact on whether they were being used or not. And then we also looked at vegetation complexity. So we did a series of vegetation surveys to see how the regeneration of the vegetation layer after fire had an impact on the use of our structures as well. So what do we end up seeing? We saw a whole bunch of stuff. So with our reptile surveys, we saw 4 to 5 main species of skink. We saw 5 small mammal species. That was antechinus, bush rats, black rats, eastern pygmy possums, and house mice. And then we also saw quite a few non-target species. So we saw 3 species of macropods, a bunch of possums, and then some pest species like pigs, rabbits, foxes, and cats. Going on to the results that we got. So you can see here our reptiles had a really strong response to our coarse woody debris piles. So this is a really great result. We found that both these 2 right-hand treatments, so the structure as well as the structure and predation, abundance was significantly higher for reptiles at those 2 treatments compared to our control and predation. And then we also did another post hoc test to see whether there was a significant difference between the structure and predation treatments to see whether that chicken wire was providing a significantly additional benefit. We found that there was not a significant benefit of the chicken wire, so there was no significant difference between those 2 treatments, which is really great because as someone who's worked with a lot of chicken wire can be kind of difficult to work with. There are animal ethics ramifications for using chicken wire in the bush with native species, and it's just, logistically difficult and costly. So knowing that there's no significant benefit of using that chicken wire can have really big operational benefits for people trying to implement this in the future. We also wanted to look at where these coarse woody debris piles, if we had to say if we wanted to provide some information for land managers as to where to specifically target the use of these structures after the next fire. So obviously it's really difficult to just put these out everywhere, and you'd want to be able to target your implementation to areas where you knew they would have the highest benefit. So you can see here that as opposed to the control and predation treatments, which are the 2 on the left, you can see that where with the structure and predation treatments, as the abundance of natural coarse woody debris decreases, the abundance associated with those 2 structures increases. So we can see that they are having the biggest benefit in areas with low natural coarse woody debris. That's really important. That is kind of as we would expect, since we're kind of trying to replicate and replace that habitat with our piles. But that was still a really exciting result to get. Moving on to how small mammals responded to our structures, not nearly as exciting as the reptile data, but we did find there was no significant difference between the control or any of our treatments. So they're not having a significant benefit for these small mammal species at the moment. So there could be a couple of reasons for this. It could be that that it just hasn't been enough time. So we've only been studying this for around a year. It could be that it takes 2, 3, 4, 5 years for these benefits to be seen in the data. It could also be that these coarse woody debris structures are not quite to the taste of small mammals in terms of nesting. And I'll talk about another potential reason for that a bit later on. But basically, it could be that they would like some more specified like nesting habitat, something a little bit closer to maybe like a nest box within these coarse woody debris piles or something like that to make it a bit more suited to them. We did, while we were taking apart these coarse woody debris piles, like I said, for the reptile surveys, we did only find 1 nest in all of the hundreds of coarse woody debris piles that we took apart. So we think we found one antechinus nest, but that is quite a low occurrence. So there's another possibility. The last reason that that could have happened would be that the vegetation in Namadgi is growing back quite quickly, especially with all the rain that we've had. So it could be that these coarse woody debris piles are not providing the kind of outsized benefit that they would, say, in a landscape that was having a much harder time recovering. So if you had, if you had a landscape where the vegetation wasn't recovering quite as quickly, you could see that how these piles would be kind of a bit more beneficial and standing out in the landscape as opposed to the landscape as it is now. So we broke it down into more species specific responses to our coarse woody debris piles, and I didn't put all of them up because there's 5 different species and 5 rounds of analysis. That's a lot of graphs, but I just wanted to highlight this one because it is quite interesting. So with the eastern pygmy possums, you can see here that in areas with low natural canopy cover, that the pygmy possums are using our structure treatments significantly more than in other instances. So this is pretty cool. Sorry, guys. This is pretty cool. It could be because pygmy possums are arboreal, and if there's low canopy cover, they might be moving along the ground a bit more. And then, you know, as they're moving along the ground in a terrestrial capacity, these coarse woody debris piles might be providing additional benefit and helping them move around the landscape a bit safer. There were a couple other responses. So moving on from, you know, specifically are our treatments working or not, we wanted to look at how small mammals were distributed in a post-fire landscape more generally. So we found that small mammal abundance and richness was significantly higher in high severity burn areas. So this is really interesting. However, I do think that this is mostly driven by bush rats and black rats. So bush rats have been shown to favor the dense vegetation after high severity burns, dense undergrowth, which is definitely occurring in most of my study sites. And we did have our highest abundance of small mammal species was bush rats and black rats. So I think those 2 species are predominantly driving the overall small mammal trends that we're seeing, but it is still interesting. We did find that a couple of our other species, so house mice and antechinus presence, was best predicted by the time of the year that I was looking at our structures. This could be because house mice, I did have quite a few house mice in my study areas, but they do seem to be quite generalist, so they might not have cared. High, low severity fire doesn't matter. In terms of the antechinus, they do have habitat preferences, but I didn't see that many antechinus, so I might not have had enough to get a significant signal from those. And then no species were significantly affected by the presence of rocky outcrops or natural coarse woody debris. So it could be that those are not limiting factors in Namadgi after this particular fire in our study areas. Like I mentioned earlier, costs of implementing different interventions is really important. So I went ahead and did a cost effectiveness analysis for my structures in relation to reptile abundance because they're quite successful for reptiles. So I broke this down by treatment and then also a couple different ways of looking at costs. So I did materials only, labor only, and then total cost of material plus labor. So you can see here that the structure treatment is significantly more cost effective than the other 2 treatments when you're looking at just materials, mostly because building a structure only coarse woody debris pile without any chicken wire on it is essentially free. You just have to go collect the coarse woody debris. And then when you're looking at labor and materials, well, it does obviously take some labor to collect the supplies, but you don't have the additional costs of the chicken wire. So overall, they are the most cost effective, but hopefully this table, you know, provides land managers in the future with the information they need to kind of make more educated decisions about what is best, what design is best for their particular circumstances. The last thing that we looked into was the thermal properties of coarse woody debris piles. So in this, we're looking at kind of mitigating thermal stress, still providing habitat in simplified landscapes, and also, you know, still mitigating that loss of natural refugia. So we wanted to see whether these coarse woody debris piles provided suitable thermal conditions whether they mimicked natural habitat thermal conditions and how those thermal conditions change over time. So this is really important. There have been a couple of studies that show that the thermal properties of artificial refuges have not been studied enough in the literature. And this is particularly a good example of this is nest boxes. There is, trying to mimic the thermal properties of an entire tree trunk with just something that's, made out of 2x4s or potentially 2x4s and insulation is challenging. And there have been some studies that have shown that poorly constructed nest boxes do create rather extreme, they can be too hot in the summer or during the middle of the day and too cold at night or over the winter. So we just wanted to double check that our structures were providing suitable thermal conditions. So we went ahead and did that by comparing a couple different types of habitats. So first off, we had an ambient temperature where we were just taking the temperature day by day of the ambient air temperature. And we did that by taking one of these little temperature loggers called an eye button and putting it under a thermal shield. So it was literally a little alfoil muffin tin liner that we got from the dollar store. We put that to kind of prevent direct solar radiation onto our eye button that would have really biased our results. And then we looked at the temperature inside rocky outcrops because rock crevices are really good habitat for small mammals and reptiles. And then we also looked at large hollow logs, which are also another form of natural habitat, and our coarse woody debris piles. And we put these eye buttons out. You can see an example of what they look like in the bottom right. And we put them out from January until August of 2022. So they recorded the temperature every 3 hours continuously until we collected them. So what did we get from that? So you can see here, this is looking at the maximum temperature over time. So with maximum temperature, we're hoping that our coarse woody debris piles are not warmer than the ambient temperature in the summer and as close to the ambient temperature or warmer if possible during the winter. So we can keep our animals from overheating in the summer and keep them nice and warm in the winter. So you can see here in the dark blue, that is our coarse woody debris piles that we were testing. And they seem to mimic the fluctuations of rock crevices pretty well. So you can see that they are a little bit warmer than a rock cavity in the summer, but still cooler than the ambient, and then actually a little bit warmer than rock cavities in winter. So it's quite a good result. When it comes to looking at the minimum temperature, we didn't get quite as good of results. You can see that the coarse woody debris, again in the blue, kind of mimics the ambient temperature a bit closer and is not providing as warm minimum temperatures in the middle of winter. So winter is, as you move towards the right, that dip there. It's not performing quite as well. However, this does go back to the theory that, multiple different types of habitat in a landscape will allow animals to move around and kind of choose the option that works best for them. So these seem to be a valuable part of the landscape. They are providing some benefits, and they also are not providing dangerous conditions, which is really what we wanted to just check against. Going back to the small mammal results, this low minimum temperature in the winter could be another potential reason that small mammals weren't making nests in our coarse woody debris piles over winter when they tend to be less active and spend a lot of time nesting. And that could be one of the driving factors. They could have just been using warmer natural alternatives. And that's it. So I just want to say thank you to all my supervisors again, my amazing field team. So Liam and Div, Maria and Jenna, who helped me haul a lot of chicken wire out of the bush. And then everyone else at the field services team here, you guys have been amazing. And then also thank you to the ACT Environmental Planning and Sustainable Development Director again for funding. Yeah, all this started when I was in lockdown in the UK, and this is all that we've been able to do. So it really takes a village, and I just want to say thank you to you all. Does anyone have any questions?
Thank you, well done. That's a remarkable outcome given all the things that were thrown at you during COVID and elsewhere. So do we have questions from people, including online?
Yes, yeah.
No,
Not just yell.
I just was wondering, you showed a couple of photos of some other things that you found and some other mammals that you saw. was there anything interesting that you recorded with other mammals that you weren't expecting to see, or like anything you found, and is that data going to be available for the park to do anything with?
Yeah, so we've actually found, so the question was, what have we been doing with all the data for the species that we've seen on our cameras that we weren't specifically interested in for our study? And one of the cool things is we've actually seen a lot of long-nosed bandicoots. So if I just get back here, I can try to find a photo of them. But long-nosed bandicoots, there hadn't been too many sightings or too many, I guess, photographed instances of bandicoots on Canberra Nature Map, which is a citizen science platform that records, occurrence of native species in Canberra. And so I was able to put all of my sightings up onto there and contribute to more information on how they're distributed in the Magi. Yeah, so you can see a long-nosed bandicoot is the one up there in the middle. So we were able to take that data and put it onto Canberra Nature Map. We've also shared all of our camera data with the ACT government, so hopefully they'll be able to use it. And all of this information that I've collected on all these other species, it's all been tagged and GPS located, and hopefully that can be used by anyone else in the future who would like to use it. And all of the information around pest species and species of interest can be used by other people because, we've already done the hard work of collecting it and tagging it and all that stuff. So someone else might as well be able to use it. So I think that's really cool. And I had a really fun time looking through all of the camera photos and seeing all the cool stuff. So yeah, Liam.
Have the land managers in the Magi been receptive to your findings?
Yes, yeah, I've had a really great chat with people in Namaji, and yeah, they're really excited about all the results, hopefully able to implement it after the next fire. But yeah, we did have a really good chat, and I am sharing all this information with, everyone in the ACT government. So hopefully, since we did get some pretty promising results with the reptiles, they'll be able to get used. And we've also discussed the potential of, it's a pretty simple method going out and just pulling together. Well, I don't know, you actually put together the course with your pals. I don't know if you'd call it simple, but like in theory, you don't need any training. Yeah, you don't need any training to do it. So you can go out, you just need a little bit of, hard work and a little bit of sweat. And but yeah, you can go out and collect these piles, and it doesn't really take any training or special equipment. So you could potentially make it, a citizen scientist initiative where people who really have, all that energy and passion about protecting native wildlife after fires can actually put that into something that we now have proven, scientific evidence that has some benefits. So that was pretty exciting. Yeah.
Question about when you put the structure down, at least at the beginning, it's kind of late.
Yeah.
How long after the fire did you structure that?
So because of the pandemic and kind of the logistical things getting the study together, we didn't end up putting them out until September of 2021. So that was roughly almost 2 years after the fire. So really, in an ideal circumstance, we would have put them out as soon as possible after the fire. But safety concerns in post-fire areas, and also logistics of getting a new project up and running. It was a little bit later, and that is part of it. If we had gotten them out a little bit earlier before the vegetation came back so strongly, or when it was still a bit drier, we could have potentially gotten stronger results because they would have been a bit more of like a big, like, come here, good habitat sign, rather than just kind of blending into the habitat that's pretty good. Yeah.
Question as well. About whether you talk about how citizen scientists could maybe go out there or the public and put these things together themselves. So, but you're also saying also strong positive effect of small mammals. And so I guess I'm also thinking that it might be disturbing habitat is ready to place for animals, and then by, I guess, promoting this to the public, people who may not know, or people wanting to do something good but maybe not the best outcomes.
Yeah.
May actually cause more destruction.
So the habitat that's really good for small mammals is normally large diameter coarse woody debris, which would be really hard to just move by yourself. So it's mostly like 20 centimeters or greater diameter. And I guess, you could, if you were providing training, you could, say like only take stuff that's under a certain diameter. But yeah, I mean, hauling around big 20 centimeter diameter logs, they're pretty sizable, and that'd be pretty difficult. So that was kind of, we did discuss, not just taking habitat and moving it and saying, oh, we found good habitat. We did want to use stuff that wouldn't have been good on its own to kind of combine that into something a bit more complex. So that was kind of the goal, was we did try to make sure that we weren't just taking good habitat away and moving it somewhere else and saying, oh, look what a good job we've done. So yeah, hopefully we wouldn't be interfering with that too much. And it wasn't bad for small mammals, it just wasn't beneficial, so.
Are there any online questions?
Yes,
Yes.
I'll read it out, from Juliana. She
Mhm.
asks, great research findings and presentation. Thank you. Do you have any views on other or further research to build on your findings?
Yes, so I think it'd be really cool. One of the things that would be really interesting would be to see the amount of invertebrate life that are in these coarse woody debris piles and whether that correlates with usage by either small mammals over longer time periods or with reptiles. Because while we were taking these structures apart to survey them, we just saw this amazing amount of invertebrate life from, you know, beetles to ants to larvae of all kinds of different things. I'm not an entomologist, so I wouldn't be able to ID it, but just kind of like that amount of biomass, I think I wasn't really expecting, and I think that was quite interesting, and it would have been good to see whether, you know, that was kind of contributing to the success potentially of these structures with reptiles, and, you know, potentially if you made them out of a different resource like plastic or metal or something like that that didn't have this invertebrate component to it, would that potentially be you know, not have the same benefits? And then also I think it would be interesting to, you know, look at these as a potential for maybe after prescribed burns, different burning applications. So, you know, prescribed burns go on all over the place. And as they, you know, become more frequent, are these a potentially beneficial thing to do to kind of help the landscape recover? Because even in those prescribed burns, foxes and cats are still present, and some of the threats are still there, albeit for normally a shorter amount of time than with a high severity burn, but that would also be interesting to see. Stu, did you have a question?
Yeah, with your different structures, you show if they like to be used more. And I guess if there are species, that's a good, like it's indicative of patronage, but
Yeah.
like, how do you know about overall population size, whether you are
Helping,
kind of improving?
whether they're just easy to sample or whether we're actually, I guess that was part of having a control, right, where we had nothing going on. So we were able to compare what was naturally occurring and then what was occurring at our structures. So hopefully it's hard to know for sure, but yeah, that was kind of part of our experimental design. So we could kind of have a bit of a baseline of what would be naturally occurring versus what was happening.
You had not much to go on profile, like
Yeah.
numbers, or
Yeah.
Bill asks, does the ACT government have plans to trial the approach to small mammals in woodland landscapes where the decline has been considerable? Says also perhaps a question for Renee from the Office of Nature Conservation.
I think so. Renee can comment on that more, but I think there's something in the works. Hopefully.
I think one of the dividing things about this project is the link between what we've done at Fenner and the ACT government.
Yeah.
Sort of very briefly outline some of the things that you've done in that space.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've had incredible support from the ACT government. I've had Renee as one of my supervisors, which has been really great. I've been able to see, you know, what goes on, what is needed from kind of that side of the coin from the management perspective, just so that we're actually creating something that is useful and doesn't just go off into the void as like, oh, that was nice, Heather. That's cute that you found that this works, but like it's not practical for actual use. So we wanted to make sure that we were getting something that actually could be used, because as we know, everyone's, you know, it's El Nino now, everyone's thinking about the next fire. But yeah, I was able to have, you know, input from Renee throughout the whole process. And I've been able to work with the ACT government on a couple different things. I've been able to come and present my research at multiple different forums, which has been really exciting. I did just present twice last week, once to the Rangers in Namaji, and then once at the Eco Focus conference that the Office of Nature Conservation holds every year. So it's really exciting to be able to get to kind of talk about my research in a bunch of different forums and make sure that it's reaching out as far as possible. And yeah, the funding was really instrumental. Like I said, getting this all up and off the ground, especially during COVID, was really challenging. So it was really great to have their support and access to, you know, all their resources. And yeah, I've been able to have a really good working relationship with the team at Namaji, which has been really fantastic. And it's nice to be able to, you know, share all the work that I'm doing with the people who are actually running the parks that we all love. So that's been really fantastic. It's been a really great experience.
Renee has answered and he says, yes, definitely. It's on the cards for the next 2 years. We're hoping to trial Heather's design and trialing the additions of nest boxes for antechinus.
Yeah, so hopefully, like I said, yeah, adding in those nest boxes would be a good add, just to kind of make them maybe a bit more tailored towards small mammals, because clearly they're a bit pickier than reptiles. But yeah, whoever does that, good luck.
Thanks, Heather.
Thank you
That's
all.
great. And if we could thank Heather again in the normal way.